the age of 5, a child's world expands dramatically as they enter preschool or kindergarten. However, for less than 1% of children, this transition triggers a severe physiological lockdown. Within the safety of their home, these children are highly communicative, utilizing a rich, fully developed vocabulary. Yet, the moment they cross the threshold into a classroom, their posture tenses up, their facial expressions blank, and most of their voice ultimately vanishes. And to an outside observer, this behavior can easily look like extreme stubbornness or an intentional refusal to cooperate. However, in reality, it is a complex involuntary survival mechanism known as selective mutism. Hi, my name is Evelyn, and welcome back to the podcast Unmuted. To preface, selective mutism is a severe anxiety disorder in which the physical capability for speech is completely offline in specific social settings where verbal communication is usually expected. And in this episode, we will be talking about the physiology of the freeze response. When an individual with selective mutism enters a triggering environment, the brain's evolutionary survival mechanisms override the rational mind. This process follows a precise neurological pathway that converts social anxiety into a state of tense physical immobility. Most of this process originates in the amygdala, as we've discussed before, the bilateral almond-shaped structure within the temporal lobes responsible for processing emotional responses and scanning the environment for threats. In individuals with selective mutism, the amygdala is fundamentally hypersensitive, and it misinterprets ordinary social stimuli such as direct questioning or the proximity of peers as immediate existential dangers. More specifically, sensory processing begins in the lateral amygdala, which passes signals directly to the central nucleus of the amygdala, or the CA. The CA serves as the absolute command hub for your body's autonomic fear responses. In a typical brain, a job of the amygdala is to scan your surroundings for danger, and this functions normally. But in an individual with selective mutism, the amygdala is fundamentally hypersensitive. It misinterprets ordinary social stimuli such as a teacher's direct questioning as another immediate threat to life. The moment that this sort of alarm goes off in the brain, the CEA fires a massive distress signal down to the hypothalamus, triggering a sympathetic nervous system discharge. Adrenaline and cortisol flood the bloodstream, and your heart rate spikes. Your breathing ultimately becomes very shallow, and most of your body gets loaded with high-octane energy designed for physical survival. Normally, we would expect that this surge of energy sort of drives your fight or flight mechanism. But sometimes what happens is that your brain calculates that you can't really run away or physically fight. And so your nervous system realizes that this sort of evasion is nearly impossible, and it defaults to the oldest defense mechanism, which is the freeze. The structure responsible for executing this physical shutdown is a dense nucleus of gray matter in the brain called the periaqueductal gray, or the PAG. Now, this is where a lot of the science and research gets really precise. In 1994, behavioral neuroscientist Dr. Michael Fanzelo published a foundational paper in the Psychonomic Bulletin and Review demonstrating that PAG isn't just a generic switch. It's actually partitioned into different areas. When the dorsal region of the PAG handles active fight or flight mechanisms, it is the ventrolateral periaqueductal gray, or the VLPAG, that explicitly drives the freeze response. When the central nucleus of the amygdala activates the VLPAG, it triggers a state of Pavlovian fear-conditioned immobility. The VLPAG sends descending inhibitory commands down the spinal cord to the musculoskeletal system. This causes a drastic increase in muscle tone, resulting in a physically rigid posture and an unblinking sort of gaze with a sharp deceleration in heart rate, known as bradycardia. We used to think that this mechanism was a simple isolated brainstem reflex, but in a breakthrough 2014 study published by the Journal of Neuroscience by Dr. T.C. Watson and his team, it proved otherwise. They discovered that during the freeze response, a functional loop forms between the PAG, the cerebellum, and the cerebral cortex. Neural activity across these areas actually synchronizes to a specific 4 to 8 hertz rhythm, and this means that the freezing is a highly coordinated, actively stabilized state in your mind. To understand the full systematic impact of the state, we have to look at Dr. Stephen Porges' pioneering work on the polyvagal theory, published in the International Journal of Psychophysiology. Porges mapped out how the autonomic nervous system responds to overwhelming threat in the phylogenetic stages. When neurosocial nervous system pathways fail to resolve a stressor, the body drops into an ancient survival mechanism run by the unmyelinated dorsal vagal complex of the vagus nerve. This triggers a profound metabolic conservation state. It forces a behavioral shutdown, drops your blood pressure, and induces a state of immobilization. However, thanks to neuroimaging studies like the 2011 fMRI research published by Dr. E.J. Ehrmans in the human brain mapping, we know that this isn't just an animal model theory. Functional fMRI scans in human experiencing acute anticipatory anxiety show an immediate heightened connectivity directly between the amygdala and these exact brainstem resources. And all of this brings us to what happens to our capacity for language. During a deep freeze state, the brain undergoes a radical reallocation of metabolic resources, and high concentrations of stress hormones temporarily impair the signaling capacity of the prefrontal cortex, stripping away its top-down control over the amygdala. And because metabolic energy and blood flow are actively diverted away from the higher thinking areas of the cerebral cortex and towards the primitive survival centers of the brainstem, language and language generating areas, these parts of the brain actively dim down. Specifically, neural activity is suppressed in Broca's area, and this is the region in the left frontal lobe responsible for speech production and grammatical structure. The complex motor coordination required to control the vocal cords, tongue, like your soft palate, and your jaw is pulled completely offline. This is the core scientific truth that completely refutes the idea that a child with selective mutism is simply being difficult. They are actually experiencing a local neurological paralysis. While gross motor movement ceases entirely, the internal processes speed up into a state of hyper-vigilant attentional lock, scanning exclusively for the optimal movement for survival action. The software required to run the machinery of speech has been totally blocked by the ventrolateral para-aqueductal gray. The hyperreactive amygdala fires an immediate distress signal to the hypothalamus. And so, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5, a formal diagnosis of selective mutism requires that the inability to speak be consistent and last longer for more than 1 month, and excluding the first month of a new school year for obvious reasons, and directly interfere with educational, occupational, or social functioning. It must be verified that the silence is not due to a lack of knowledge or comfort with the primary spoken language. epidemiological data reveals a significant demographic imbalance. Selective mutism is diagnosed in females approximately twice as often as in males, and rather than pointing to a distinct genetic vulnerability, modern clinical research indicates that this disparity is heavily driven by a diagnostic bias. For example, external symptoms. When a young boy experiences severe social anxiety, their distress often manifests as externalized disruptive behaviors such as hyperactivity, temper tantrums, or aggression. These behaviors draw immediate attention, though they are frequently mislabeled or misdiagnosed as conduct issues or ADHD. In contrast, the quiet, compliant, and rigid freeze response observed in young girls frequently aligns with the traditional societal expectations of passivity and compliance. As a result, their internal terror goes unnoticed, and their diagnosis is often delayed until adolescence or adulthood. So overall, in essence, selective mutism rarely exists in isolation. Between 75 to 100% of individuals with this condition also meet the full diagnostic criteria for social anxiety disorder. It also frequently clusters with underlying communication disorders such as speech fluency issues or auditory processing delays, as well as the environmental stress of immigrating to a region with a different primary language. So that concludes this episode of Unmuted. Thank you for listening and see you next week.